Thank you very much for your presentation, Ms. Scott. I would like to now take some questions. I'd just like to explain today's Q&A. At the time of application for this seminar, we already received lots of questions, and I think you must have a list of questions. So first of all, I'd like to pick some of those and ask them these questions. Then I'll open the floor so that you can ask some other questions. So for your part, Ms. Scott, well, actually, we have time for question Q&A until noon. So please refer to your Q&A sheets. The first item. So let me start with number 1. If a large firm's activities cover all stages of production up to packaging, or employing a co-packer, contract packer, does prevention control for human food apply to the firm? Actually, this should be PCHF, prevention control for human food. In the case that the produce label displays the name of the large firm. So can somebody answer that question?
So this is actually a registration question because, as you know, the first step to determining whether the preventive controls for human foods applies is whether or not you have to register. We have some information on our registration webpage related to this, but contract manufacturers who manufacture, process, pack, or hold food for consumption in the United States must register. Whether the big company would have to register or not would depend on whether they do any manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding of food. So let's assume that this big company has this food manufactured by the contract packer, and he doesn't see the food at all. It goes directly from the contract manufacturer to shipping overseas. Then the big company would not be required to register. However, if the big company that contracted for that manufacturing does take possession of the food is prepared by the contract manufacturer and shipped to the big company, and it's held in that company's warehouse until it's shipped overseas, then that company also has to register.
はい、ありがとうございます。そうしましたら、
Thank you for your response.
So moving on to question number 2, our understanding is that even if a firm observes HACCP, it has to review whether its HACCP system meets the requirements of PCHF, since HACCP does not review the risks other than critical control points. Is this understanding correct?
So facilities having HACCP plans may need to supplement these plans because, as you're correct, the HACCP plan leads only to controls at critical control points, and there may be other preventive controls. I'm sure that those of you who are familiar with HACCP also are familiar with the concept of prerequisite programs, which are other food safety related programs that are foundational to HACCP. Many companies that have HACCP plans and prerequisite programs will be very close to doing what they need to comply with preventive controls for human foods. But it would be a very good idea for a firm that already has a HACCP plan to look at what else the preventive controls for human food rule requires and determine whether or not he needs to make any modifications. We have specified that the food safety plan doesn't have to be a single document, so we're not expecting people to rewrite their HACCP plans to make them into food safety plans. They would just have to supplement their HACCP plan with the other programs that are required.
Thank you. The next question. Suppose there is a supplier who had obtained GFSI certification and received audits periodically. Our understanding is that in the supply chain program, holders of GFSI and benchmark organizers can say that they reviewed the supplier only after their standards are assessed to meet the FISMA requirements, in addition to receiving the audits. That is, until they are assessed to meet the FISMA requirements, the compliance with standards and results of the audit should be explained from the supplier side to the manufacturing side, which buys the raw material. Is this correct?
Have not been compared with the requirements under preventive controls for human food yet, except in one instance. One law firm has conducted such an analysis with respect to the SQF scheme, which is a GFSI scheme. We expect that in the future, these audit schemes will do their own evaluation of how they compare with the preventive controls rule and will likely make some modifications. But right now, a GFSI audit probably does not provide all the information that we would be looking for with respect to an on-site audit conducted under to meet the requirements of a supplier verification activity under the preventive controls for human foods rule.
Thank you very much. Questions 4, 5, and 6, I'd like to ask this together. Regarding PCQI, as Mr. Ito mentioned in his presentation, a person who has knowledge acquired regarding this PCQI training, where in Japan can we receive this training, and also equivalent or superior level of training will suffice. Where is this being provided? Is the standard curriculum available? Also, a person who has knowledge acquired through having made HACCP in the past is sufficient as PCQI, even though he has not taken the training with the level stipulated by the FDA. Is this correct? And what competency proves oneself as a PCQI other than training designated by FDA?
Thank you. A lot of questions in there. So let's start with the PCQI. Remember that there are two ways to be a PCQI. One is to take the training that is equivalent to the standardized curriculum recognized by FDA, and the other way is to be experienced through his training and his application of a food safety plan in work. So a lot of people out there who've been trained in HACCP and who familiarize themselves with the additional requirements of the preventive controls rule will probably meet the requirement for a PCQI that is based on job experience. Now let me go back to the training curriculum that the FSPCA has developed. That is the standardized curriculum recognized by FDA. And they have an international subcommittee, as Mr. Ito mentioned, and that subcommittee is charged with developing outreach and training overseas. There is one member of the FSPCA International Committee that has done HACCP training here in Japan, and they are interested in translating the curriculum into Japanese and conducting training here in Japan. So that will probably happen in the next few months. The standardized curriculum will be made available on the FSPCA website, so anyone will be able to see what is in the curriculum. Of course, we encourage people to become lead instructors and trainers of trainers through the Alliance because they will get a true understanding of FDA's expectations through taking that type of training. But it would not be essential that everyone take that training just to become a PCQI. There was something else I wanted to say. That is with regard to how we're going to determine whether someone meets the requirements of PCQI. We hope that we're going to train our inspectors not to be walking into facilities and say, who's your PCI? And What's the basis for that person being a PCQI? Where's his training certificate, or what's his experience? The approach we plan to use is to come in and evaluate a food safety plan. And if the food safety plan is deficient in any way, the underlying root cause of that may be because of inadequate training. And we will be exploring root causes of deficiencies that may lead us to that conclusion.
はい、先ほどおっしゃったように、
What you said earlier about the standard curriculum being available on the website, is this the FDA website? Is it easy to find on the FDA website?
The FSBC curriculum is not yet available on a website. It will be on the FSPCA website, which you can find information to link to the FSPCA website on the FDA's website. But again, they have not yet posted it. They are still making some changes to the curriculum. As you know, anytime you develop a curriculum of this magnitude, there will be errors, and we've identified a number of errors, and we're making changes. And as soon as we get the latest set of changes available, then that will be the document that will be made available for people to translate it into other languages. And Camille wants to add to that.
I'd like to really reinforce the importance of the alliances in this international set of subcommittees that's being put in place. It's really clear that we're at the beginning of the process now. Our aspiration, though, is over time we'll have a number of linkages with institutions here in country. We're very hopeful that over time there'll be a number of individuals that have lead instructor training. But what Jenny is saying is very important. There are really two routes. It's the FDA training and then the experience. Both are important. 5 years from now, we're really confident that there'll be a strong cadre of individuals who have been trained as leads. We're also very confident that there'll be some strong partners here in Japan to help extend the training. Thank you.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much for your comments. Question 7. This is again about the PCQI adequacy, so it's not to be checked. Am I correct? And then moving on to number 8. So is there any website where we can see if a person is a leading instructor for FDA? So leading instructor actually will provide training to, so my understanding correct, leading instructor means somebody who provides a training for the PCQI candidates. Am I right? So any website available where we can see if a person is a leading instructor for the FDA? That is a question.
Safety Preventive Controls Alliance plans to put on their website a list of lead instructors. Right now we have that list, but what we need to do is make sure that people who do not want to be listed because their only training will be within their particular companies. But very shortly there will be a list of food safety preventive controls lead instructors on that website.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you.
So here we would like to move to questions regarding PCAF. We're going to question number 39. We are considering exporting pet food to the U.S. in the future, so please clarify the differences from PCHF.
Animal food rule is very similar to the Preventive Controls for Human Foods rule. It requires a food safety plan with a hazard analysis. One of the main differences, of course, is that there are different hazards for animal food than there are for human food. For example, food allergens are not considered a hazard significant for animal food. Also, for animal food, it's important to consider nutritional deficiencies and toxicities when doing the hazard analysis. But in general, the requirements are the same. When you talk about pet food, there are different types of pet food, and canned pet food is a low-acid canned foods product. And just as with the preventive controls for human food, low-acid canned food, pet food, is exempt with respect to microbiological hazards, but the firm would have to consider whether there are chemical or physical hazards that apply to that food.
Thank you very much.
続きまして質問
Next question, question 40. This is about the pet food export. So third-party certification, ISO 22000 will be also applied the animal feed manufacturing, and we hear there is a new specification. So acquiring this qualification is an advantage for the exporters to the U.S.
ISO 22000 is a food safety scheme, just as many of the GFSI schemes. FSS 22000 is one of those. We have not done an analysis of any of these schemes to determine whether or not they meet the requirements of the preventive controls for human food or the preventive controls for animal food. Certainly, someone that has committed to doing all of the activities that are necessary with respect to being certified to ISO 22000 will be well on the way to having a food safety plan consistent with our preventive controls rule. But there are some differences that may apply, and I can't tell you what those are because I have not done the analysis.
Understood. So number 41. What is the extent of the requirements for supplier control? Is an annual audit required for all suppliers of raw materials? There are more than 20 raw materials used for some products. I think this also goes into PCHF, but what about this question?
This applies to both rules, and again, a supply chain applied control is the basis for determining whether a facility needs to have a supplier program. So first, it applies to a manufacturer processor, so it's not applicable to distributors or to brokers or to warehouses. It has to be a manufacturer processor that is going to use a raw material or ingredient. And many of the raw materials or ingredients that go into a food will have hazards that are addressed in the manufacturing process, whether it's human food or animal food. It's only the situation where that specific hazard has been controlled before receipt that a facility would have to employ a supply chain program. So no, a supply chain program is not necessary for all raw materials and ingredients. Some of them don't have any hazards, and some of them will have hazards that are controlled during manufacturing.
Thank
you very much.
So back to preventive controls for human food. Question 11. Question 11. Excuse me. Question number 9. Sorry. So in manufacturing Japanese tea, there are two plants, crude tea plant and processed tea plants. The former has been through primary processing where fresh tea leaves are steamed and dried. It is generally owned by tea leaf producers and by a small entity or family with 2 to 3 members. The latter has been through secondary processing, where the dried tea is cleaned, removing food hazards by tea merchants or tea manufacturers to the extent of 0.25 order of activities. The processed tea plant, the dry leaf is screened, cut, and roasted. In which process for each plant is PC FHF applicable?
Information here, but let me take a stab at that. If the crude tea plant is on a farm, then the drying of tea was within the farm definition.
じゃあ今ちょっと略してしまったところ
So let me just back it up. I'll just explain again. So the primary processing. So the plant owned by tea leaf producers and say small entity, family business, 2 to 3 members. Then there is a secondary stop, secondary processing. So the removal of food hazards by tea merchant or tea manufacturer. And then as a result, which water activities goes down 0.25. So
Are any of these activities conducted on the farm? Is that initial drying on the farm or is it off the farm? So you
農場
say
以
that,
外ですね。
actually the activity takes place not on the farm, so in other sites.
so if this is not on the farm and it's an operation not owned by the farmers that are growing the tea, then it is a facility that is subject to the preventive controls for human foods rule. Now, keep in mind that there may be foods in which there are no hazards that require preventive controls. So you would have to look at this operation and decide whether there are hazards associated with the raw tea before drying, and if any of those are controlled during the drying process, or not, and or if there are any hazards that remain after drying that could present a hazard to consumers. For example, we know that salmonella can be present on raw materials, and it undergoes drying very well and survives in the dry state for a very long time. So that would be something that tea producers would need to consider.
はい。じゃあ今
Camille has some comments.
はい。
Not a comment, but a question. It's part of the question around the exemption for small entity. Could you please
that's good.
clarify that?
Yeah, well, and maybe I can answer that. You don't need to clarify the question. If these facilities are very small businesses, then they would be qualified facilities subject to modified requirements. They would not have to have a food safety plan, but they would have to attest to FDA that they meet the definition of a qualified facility, and then they would have to attest to one of two things: either that they've identified hazards, implemented preventive controls, and are monitoring those, if there are any hazards again, or that they are in compliance with a non-federal food safety law, which could be a food safety law of a foreign country. And so it's very possible that a number of these facilities meet the definition of a qualified facility as a very small business with less than $1 million in sales of human food.
はい。会場の皆様の中でお茶のご関係者の方。
Is there anybody related to tea manufacturing, tea production in the audience who would like to ask additional questions related to this? Anybody with a question related to tea? Because we have received many relating to tea beforehand. But if not, I would like to move on to question number 10. In an FDA audit, the agenda or the content of the food safety plan is reviewed. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, when FDA does an inspection, then if this is a facility that is subject to the requirements to have a food safety plan, they would look at the food safety plan. If, on the other hand, they were going to a qualified facility, which does not have to have a food safety plan, they would be inspecting for compliance to our good manufacturing practice requirements. And let me add to that again, there are compliance dates that are staggered. The first compliance date, which is for the very large facilities, is September 19th of 2016, this year. The small facilities have another year until September 18th of 2017, and the very small facilities do not have to comply until September 17th of 2018, with one exception. If someone thinks that they will be a qualified facility, they need to start keeping the financial records to support that starting this month. Otherwise, they won't have enough financial records to make that determination when they have to come into compliance in 2018.
Thank you. Question 11. Would you please indicate which part of the record we should translate into English in preparation for the FDA audit? Yes, this is one of the frequent asked questions. So in relation to translation, so could you please answer this one?
The preventive controls for human food or for animal food rule does not require that records be kept in English. When FDA comes to do a foreign inspection, they will bring someone with them to do translation. But I'd like to turn this over to Brian Pendleton to make a comment with respect to the foreign supplier verification programs.
Yes, thank you. With respect to FSVP, the original proposal said that records would be required to be in English, but in the final rule, that is not the case. The records can maybe maintained in the language that they were created in, but the final rule does require that the importer have a qualified individual who can understand that language of the records that they are reviewing as part of their activities. And similar to with preventive controls, FDA may request translation within a reasonable time when they are conducting an inspection of an importer or requesting records from an importer.
So here's a general rule of thumb with respect to records. If we have a form that we require you to submit to us, then it must be in English. But other records that you have to keep that we might have to access do not have to be in English.
So thank you for number 12. So moving on to number 13. SAHCODHA. This is the serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals. Is there any clear classification or a list to discern a certain food will fall in the category of this SAHCODHA?
We have never made a definition of serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals, or SACODA as we call it. However, there are places where you can make a determination of the types of contamination events that we think meet these requirements. For example, we have a reportable food registry that requires people to report to us when they make a determination that a food may present a risk of serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals. So if you look at the reportable food registry reports, and we have about 4 years' worth posted on our website, where they will give you specific examples of the types of contamination that meet our definition of serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals. You can also look on our website to see what has been classified as a Class 1 recall, because again, Class 1 recalls meet the definition of food presenting the risk of serious adverse health consequences or death.
Well, back to your previous point, the registration site. So can we find that site for registration very easily if you visit FDA website?
If you go to www.fda.gov and click on the tab for food, then there will be a place on that web page for you to go to the registration website. And there will also be a place for reportable foods on that web page.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you. Next question. Questions 14 and 15 somewhat relevant. So please indicate the differences and compatibilities between FSS 22000 and FISMA requirements, since we want to compensate for the inadequacies, similarities, differences between those two. And also, what is the likely pitfalls? What are we likely to miss? And also, to meet a FISMA requirement, what additional actions do we need to take for FSSC, SQF, and Codex HACCP?
Thank you for that question. Get it a lot with respect to a number of food safety schemes that people are being audited to and certified to. FDA has not done a comparison of any of these schemes to our rules. We would expect the scheme owners will make that analysis, and hopefully they will revise their schemes to be consistent with our rule. We would also think that someone who has been certified to one of these schemes, like FSS 22000, would do their own comparison with the preventive controls rule and determine where there might be any deficiencies. Some of the places that there could be deficiencies are things like the supply chain program, which may not be explicit in any of these schemes, or the specific requirement to do environmental monitoring where ready-to-eat foods are exposed to the environment. Neil has a comment.
Just want to go back to the previous question about registration and really reinforce that you want to register at the FDA official site. It's interesting, I just Googled it a couple days ago, and a number of private companies came up for FDA registration, but the only place you can register is the official FDA site. So just be a little careful with that. Thank you.
Yeah,
And it's free.
Yeah, exactly. That's the main point. These other sites will offer to register you for a fee, but you can do it yourself. It's very simple, and it is free on our website.
はい、皆様お気をつけていただきたいと思います。
Thank you, everyone. So please be careful on that point. Next, number 16. I want to know if there is a rule regarding a method for bacteriological testing on food exports to the U.S.
The methods that FDA uses for foods are in our bacteriological analytical manual, which can be found on the FDA website. And these are the tests that we will use to test foods, to test imports. And so we would encourage people to look there first for methods. Also, some specific regulations may have a method associated with that. Most do not. Most are very general and require the testing to be done by scientifically valid methods. And that is what we require for product testing in the preventive controls rule, that you use a scientifically valid method, such as the bacteriological analytical manual methods, or AOAC, or ISO, that have been validated for specific foods. And Bruce would like to make a comment?
I think one of the key issues to remember is that if you have a process that's validated and you've documented that validation, we would accept that if it meets the standards. So we don't say you have to have this glass, but if you can prove to us that your test works and you have the evidence that you have validated that method, we would accept that. So it's not a forced, you must use this one, but the obligation is on you to demonstrate that the method that you're using has indeed been validated in your situation, not just accepted off the shelf and followed routinely, but you have the evidence and the data to support that validation method that you may be using.
Thank you. Question 17. Could you please clarify known hazards, since we have to manage all hazards in HAPC, hazard analysis and preventive control. So are you planning to publish known hazards in foods? Do you publish the method used in preventive control or guidelines showing the standards to meet? So do you have any plans to publicize guidelines showing those standards to meet?
Very good question to ask. A hazard analysis must be done specific to a food and a facility. So we would not be telling people what the hazards are associated with the food they're producing. We would expect people to go to the scientific literature to look at where the outbreaks have been. The same places that you have gone to do a hazard analysis for a HACCP plan can apply here. Then we will be publishing a guidance on hazard analysis and preventive controls, and in there we will attempt to list various food types and what we think are known or reasonably foreseeable hazards that someone would need to consider when they're doing their own food safety plan. So again, we're not saying by listing these that we expect people to control that hazard in that food. We are saying that we would expect people to do an analysis and determine whether or not that was a hazard requiring a preventive control in their facility.
Thank you very much. So regarding this guideline to be published, I'm sure this is something everyone is most interested in. So when will this guideline be published? If you know, please tell us.
The guidance document is in development. What we have decided to do to get the preventive controls for human foods guidance out more quickly is to divide it up. And we will issue the first 5 basic chapters that will talk about how to do a hazard analysis and what the reasonably foreseeable hazards are with respect to potential foods, and what are likely preventive controls for those hazards in the first guidance to come out. And then we will supplement that with guidance related to specific preventive controls, like what you need to know about developing and applying a heat treatment or a formulation control. We still have a ways to go on this guidance. We understand that people are very anxious to see it, but we are trying to work through and make sure we have a sound document before we send it forward into clearance. It will go through clearance and then will be issued as a draft guidance for people to send us comments, and then we will finalize it. So we will publicize this on our FSMA webpage when it's available, and we would encourage you to look at that and make a determination of what you think we could do to improve the guidance, or if it's missing a particular type of food that you are particularly interested in, let us know, and we'll see what we can do to accommodate you.
Thank you very much. So we are looking forward to it. Thank you. Question 18. So this is about the botulinus of the green tea PET bottle. And if we have an analytical result which shows the catechin value exceeding the limited value, and the Canada Association in Japan actually recommends the culture testing with botulinus 1.5 times, and or any other evidence required. Can we use the scientifically proved data as evidence? And do we keep those records together with a food safety plan?
I'm going to need some clarification here. Are you talking about canned tea, a low-acid canned foods, which has controls for Clostridium botulinum applied to it. Or-
ペットボトルです。
I'm talking about the pet bottle tea. So green tea pet bottles. That is a question.
I would have to consult with our low-acid canned foods people, but I think that they may consider those types of beverages to be either acidified foods or low-acid foods. And it's been my experience, back in a past life when I did research on Clostridium botulinum in tea, that tea does not support the growth of Clostridium botulinum unless you add things like milk to it. We would expect that people that produce these types of products to assess the hazard of Clostridium botulinum and determine whether or not their control measures do prevent the risk from toxin from Clostridium botulinum. And that may be based on the fact that the formulation does not support the growth of Clostridium botulinum. And I believe that there is someone here in Japan that has done the testing, and that information should be available, I think.
Does anybody have any comment from the audience? No? Okay, so the question 19 is, so actually I'll just skip 19. So now we'd like to open the floor to take questions from the audience.
If you have a question, please raise your hand. No question? Please wait for the staff to come with a microphone.
And something that Mr. Ito asked, and that is with respect to polishing rice and whether or not that would be considered a low-risk activity food combination. And I can answer that by saying, no, it can't. Not that I necessarily believe there are hazards associated with that, but because the list of low-risk activity food combinations, which get an exemption if they're done by a small or very small business on farm, was developed through a risk assessment process. And nobody sent us any comments that said that polishing of rice was done on a farm, so we did not include that in our risk analysis. And so when we generated our final list, and it is a comprehensive list, only the foods and activities that are on that list are considered low-risk activity food combinations. Anything that's done outside that would not be exempt. Sorry.
Thank you very much for a very thorough explanation, and I'm beginning to understand. I am Inoue from JC Japan. My question, going back to one of the slides, please wait a moment. Slide 13, page 13, regarding food safety plan versus HACCP plan, the comparison. So on the right-hand side, we have the HACCP plan, and we have 7 items. So these are basically 7 principles of HACCP, as I understand. And on the left-hand side, we have the food safety plan, and we have 7 principles. Are these already established as the 7 principles of this food safety plan, or are they still in the draft stage? That's my first question. And the second question, this food safety plan includes a recall plan. For a recall plan, which item out of the 7 items here will it be included in?
So these do not really indicate specific principles for a food safety plan. This is mainly intended to show that what you do to develop a HACCP plan is a little bit different when you develop a food safety plan, and it's primarily because the food safety plan addresses hazards, addresses controls at places other than critical control points. So maybe this slide is not the best one to show. It's a little unclear. And it did not include all of the differences because it does not talk specifically about the recall plan, which is required when a food has a hazard that requires a preventive control. And it also doesn't explicitly talk about the supply chain program. I hope that clarifies it for you.
はい、ありがとうございます。他にいかがでしょうか。
Any other questions? Thank you very much for your detailed explanation. 2 questions. Question 1, so in your presentation, you talked about food safety plan and also the difference between the HACCP and food safety plan. As a result of hazard analysis, actually, there may be a situation where there is no CCP. So if there is no CCP in HACCP, then it's the same as food safety plan. Am I correct? And also the seafood, for example, HACCP requirement exists already. So exempt from PHF. So any difference in implementation, which is more strict, or one is more strict than the other? So any differences in the degree of strictness as well?
Seafood requirements are an existing law, and that has not changed. It's sufficiently similar. It's a preventive control program that Congress said we will exempt seafood and juice HACCP facilities from the requirements for preventive controls. With respect to the preventive controls, first of all, you have to start with a hazard analysis. And then you have to look at those hazards and how they would be controlled. Some of them will be controlled through critical control points, such as a kill step for pathogens. But others will be things like sanitation controls. A facility that is producing 2 different foods on the same line, and one of them has a milk allergen and the other one does not, needs to have sanitation controls to ensure that milk is not present in the food that doesn't declare milk on the label. And we would not expect someone to have critical control points for that sanitation program. They would have sanitation standard operating procedures that that they know will remove the milk residue from the equipment, but we would not expect them to monitor that cleaning in the same way they would monitor, say, the time and temperature of a kill step. I hope that helps understand this a little better. Again, it's still tied to the hazard analysis. So it's not just all of the controls in a facility, it's all the controls that are related to a hazard.
よろしいでしょうか。
Thank you.
Anyone else? Gentleman in the front.
Can you help me understand what are some of the responsibilities that the exporter needs to oblige by So in a case where an exporter in Japan buys products from a Japanese manufacturer and exports that food product to the U.S., to a U.S. importer, what are some of the obligations that the exporter needs to take on individual from the responsibilities of the food manufacturer?
That's a good question, and I think I would like to hold that question until after we've gone through the foreign supplier verification program, and then we can get back to it. So please ask it again this afternoon in our Q&A session.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please. Two questions. First question, vegetable, fruits, and wholesale markets, as well as the seafood wholesale markets, are they included in FSMA requirements? So are they covered as well? Wholesale markets, vegetable, fruits, seafood.
Complicated question. Let us discuss this internally and get back to you this afternoon with an answer. Camille, would you write that question now? Thank you. It's a little complicated, so I want to work out a clear response for you. And is there another question?
Another question? Yes. Well, actually, there was a question regarding tea, so let me come back. So let me explain the manufacturing process. So you pick up tea leaves, then those tea leaves are steamed, and the steamed leaves actually are crushed and then dried. They are dried. And so these processes are handled by the tea farmers. And once they are dried, and they go to the tea manufacturers. So they buy these dried leaves and they screen them and they blend them, and then they make a final tea products. That is to say, so the Japanese tea farmers or tea growers, so process such as steaming or drying, so the farmers have steaming or drying facilities. In that case, the tea farmers, so do we have to look at them in relation to the agri-foods control, or would that be a part of the control for human food, preventive control for human food?
Can you tell me what the purpose of the steaming is of the tea leaves?
蒸す目的は
The purpose of steaming? Well, the purpose is, well, tea leaves, once they are picked, actually they fermented naturally. So we want to stop that fermentation, and we need steaming process.
So we're going to have some discussion at the office about that. Certainly the drying of tea leaves on a farm would be within the farm definition. The steaming may be considered manufacturing and processing, so we'll have to have that discussion with the team back at the office to make that determination. But if the steaming goes on the farm, then that could be a facility that has to register. It could be a farm mixed type facility, but there may be no hazards that are being controlled there, so they may not have to do anything but the hazard analysis to determine that. Then again, these may be very small farms, so they may be qualified facilities, in which case they would have very limited activities to do with respect to what they're doing on the farm. The other steps that take place at the manufacturing facility are subject to the Preventive Controls for Human Foods rule.
100万ドル以上の
Well, you mentioned 1 million threshold. Some growers actually the sales are above $1 million, and also for the U.S. actually 50%, more than 50% of Japanese tea grown actually go to the U.S. So we are very interested to know the answer.
And we will get back to you. We have a lot of questions about tea that we have to discuss.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. So perhaps we can take one more question from the floor. Anybody with a question? Any question from the floor? So this will be the last question for this Q&A session. Sorry, me again. Going back to the slide, page 15, you talked about the supply chain program. And here, you talk about use of approved suppliers. This approved suppliers, for example, can this be a verbal approval, or can this should this approval be in a written form? What kind of approval do you have in mind when you say use of approved suppliers?
Yes, there is a requirement to approve suppliers, and there are some specific things that have to be considered in approving suppliers, and the approval of suppliers does have to be a written document. The things that you would have to consider are the same things that you would consider in determining the supplier verification activity and how frequently it is to be conducted. So you would look at whether or not the facility is subject to U.S. FDA regulations, and if so, whether or not they're subject to a warning letter or import alert. This does not mean you can't use them, but you have to consider this in deciding whether or not you are going to approve them for use of their ingredients in your facility. You would also have to consider what your experience has been with that supplier, if you've been using that supplier in the past. Have they given you adulterated food, unsafe food, or not? Or do you have a 20-year record of good compliance from them? That all goes into putting them on your approved supplier list. Then, when you receive materials into your facility, you must document that they were received from an approved supplier.